What is going on YouTube? This is Acid Root. So I'm going to review the third album by Smash Mouth. And basically this came out in the fall of 2001 and it's the self-titled album Smash Mouth. Now they had a contest on their website the year before to name this album and folks went with self-titled for what they should call it. Now I don't know. I tried looking around to see if I could find what the other name was going to be, but I wonder. So, I mean, leave a comment if you know what that album was supposed to be called. If you, I mean, especially if you knew about the contest, 20 something years ago and you had seen the other winning one. But just to kind of say, this is kind of a subdued album for a number of reasons. Like, it just kind of felt like Smash Mouth kind of dried up in 2001. It's not to say this album is bad, but it just doesn't have the beleaguering kind of overt kind of charisma and charm of like Astro Lounge from 1999. Now that one made it to like the fourth single, had three top 20 singles or at least three hit singles on the Billboard 100 and that type of stuff. Just a very massive album that wasn't just a rock chart only type hit, and it just did a lot of things right, especially songs like All Star and Then the Morning Comes, which just really crossed over. And Smash Mouth in 97 wasn't too much to sneeze at either. But this album, apart from I'm a Believer, was kind of mediocre, or maybe not so much mediocre, but just kind of lukewarm in terms of the reception it got. It went gold, which means it sold 500,000 copies, but paled compared to like the multi-platinum ones of their 97 and 1999 albums. But the reason behind that, I think Steve Harwell was subdued because of the death of his 6-month-old child in the summer of 2001. This album was originally supposed to drop somewhere in like the late summer of 2001. And yeah, I mean, the death of a child can be devastating, and it probably impacted the impact of what was going to happen. Now, I think just to be able to talk, I mean, this album was made after his child's death, and I think he was kind of like hurt in a lot of ways and devastated in a lot of ways, and that's kind of. But I look after it like this album is just very scattershot, and it just makes me wonder as to whether or not there was just a Smash Mouth era and stuff, just because like this, the same thing happened to Sugar Ray, where Sugar Ray's 2001 album just didn't do the damage of their 99 and 97 albums. I want to say that there were some other folks like Third Eye Blind. It just felt like a lot of bands that were kind of popular between like the late 90s and very early 2000s just kind of dried up around this time. And things were shifting. Folks like Good Charlotte and Green Day were starting to get more popular, and things like that. And it just kind of felt like pop rock kind of diminished. I just can't think of too many pop rock things. Kind of shifted to things like Nickelback and Puddle of Mud and that type of stuff. So it was more alternative metal with new metal type stuff and post grunge type stuff. And then also like the punk type stuff like Blink 182 and stuff that kind of outshined Smash Mouth around this time. They just felt really kind of out of place, and they just stuck out like a sore thumb, especially past. I mean, I think they made it at least until about the year 2000, but it was just so strange seeing this album, the context of how they kind of got ship held and swashed and swashbuckled out of the context of being like a predominant factor. Because in the summer of 1999, Smash Mouth was kind of in like the crest of what they were doing, but by the fall of 2001, they were kind of more of an afterthought, and that's kind of disappointing just because I look after it. There are some good gems on here, but for the most part, apart from I'm a Believer, I feel like this album was basically just cast aside, not really given much of a second or a third thought. So it's just kind of the thing, but it's still good. I mean, you'll just have to study this project a little bit more so than expect. I just severely doubt that Pacific Coast Party, which is the highest charting single apart from I'm a Believer, would really get much airplay. It charted at like 114 on the Billboard 100 and 23 out of 30 on the rock chart. So it just kind of feels not the crest of like I'm a Believer till then the morning comes, All Star and Walking on the Sun and some of those type ones, and Can't Get Enough of You Baby. So I just would have to say they just went back to how they were back in 97 when their second highest song in 97 was basically Why Can't We Be Friends. That just kind of happens to be a thing. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about the singles. So the first single is I'm a Believer. The first song is I'm a Believer, and this was a pretty large song. This really happened to be feel good energy. Kind of took them back to like the vibes of like Walking on the Sun and Can't Get Enough of You Baby from some of their earlier albums. But it just is a real good feel good dance tune. This one's just really kind of peppy and just kind of feels like something that like the Beatles would do, and folks of like the 60s and 70s and stuff that just kind of make like these kind of doo-wop kind of jivey bops that just are kind of more meant for jukebox dancing and that type of stuff. It's just kind of an it's just kind of an old-fashioned dance tune, but it works pretty well. I mean, it's just a real kind of peppy, this kind of keeps them with their kind of pop rock and more kind of not, I don't want to say PG related, but just kind of more all ages kind of dance bop as far as that kind of goes. It's not so much like an edgier one like I feel like Pacific Coast Party is, but it's just kind of an all ages. Originally seeing the kind of context I think this album would have had. If it would have had like at least one or two more songs like I'm a Believer, I think this would have probably been as large as Astro Lounge and Fushu Mang. But for what it is, this is just a taste of what the concept that was kind of going along with it. But Smash Mouth, this kind of I mean, it's not, I don't detract from them in terms of context of how things turned out throughout 2001, but it's just kind of, you look at it and it's like, it's just kind of one of those situations that this was kind of like an oddball. It just feels like this album didn't really have this song on it. It kind of feels like I'm a Believer was just like a spare single just because this album just did not do that well apart from this song. That just really happens to be a thing, but it is a hit. Definitely is at least one song that you can see that crested into like mainstream and super mainstream territory. But apart from that, this is like the only real hit that in terms of like a broad appeal really connected. The second single is Pacific Coast Party. And this is, I like this song. It didn't really chart that well, but like I said, it charted modestly, but it just didn't do the damage of their typical singles and stuff, kind of put them back in the territory where they were back in 1997. But I see Pacific Coast Party as like a mellow beach party evening tune. Kind of gets you hyped, but it's just not as crazy as usual. I really, you can tell by Steve Harwell's lyrics in these songs that he just didn't have the ferociousness. And even I'm a Believer off this album, and like All Star and Walking on the Sun, and some of those. It's just very mellow and just kind of this really kind of, it's not basic in terms of quality, but it's just kind of relaxed and just a lot more like Smash Mouth has always been known for their riveting and kind of not necessarily over the top, but just kind of ravenous and like a festive and kind of all ages kind of way. They just had like that spark of just infectious energy, but this song really doesn't do it. It's the Pacific Coast. I really like the kind of beach party kind of guitar licks on the song that just kind of make it more of like a this kind of something that it feels like. I can't really think of too many folks that kind of did surf related material, but this is just kind of an odd one. I want to say Sugar Ray kind of did this stuff with 1459, but it's just kind of more of like a mellow summer day, like a this mellow May or June kind of day, not like a scorching July or August day, but I do like the concept behind it. Really nice tune. It's overlooked. I would definitely recommend messing with it, fucking with it to kind of see what's up with it. This it's a very overlooked tune. It's just not commonly talked about amongst Smash Mouth's best hits, but it is good. It just doesn't have that overcast like predominant kind of hook like every single they dropped prior to this one does. But the third single, their second attempt at trying to get their swagger back, was Holiday in My Head. And this is another one this crested in the winter of 2002. This is kind of this is solid summer restaurant music. It's very out on the town, but it's another one that's somewhat subdued. This one kind of reminds me of the vibes that they had on Why Can't We Be Friends, which was kind of very much restaurant music. And it's the same thing with uh, it's the same thing with like Walking on the Sun. I feel like Walking on the Sun and Why Can't We Be Friends were restaurant music, just kind of out and about shopping music, just kind of being in the city during the daytime, just day commute. I feel like Holiday in My Head accomplishes that, but it's just a very more kind of relaxed and just lambent version of the stuff that they were typically doing in 97 and 99. It's good, but it just doesn't even have the energy of Why Can't We Be Friends and Walking on the Sun, which was before they really cracked even in like the solitary mainstream charts and stuff. So it just kind of it has the quality, but these are just kind of more alternative, and they just went back to kind of being an alternative rock highlight more so than trying to be like the overcast juggernaut that they were in 1999. So it's just too bad. And even 97 a little bit. I feel like this, out of these three albums that they dropped, I feel like Smash Mouth is probably the weakest of like the three albums, their 97, 99, and 2001 albums in terms of like at least popularity. I mean, these songs are good. I definitely would recommend Pacific Coast Party and Holiday in My Head, but you may notice that these songs like Holiday in My Head and Pacific Coast Party just don't hit as heavily as like the later singles from Fushu Mang, like uh, Why Can't We Be Friends, and even the Fawns. Like I feel like the Fawns, which didn't chart at all either, had more spark and bustle to it than Holiday in My Head did. And I feel like Why Can't We Be Friends is about the same valve in turn. Well, I would say Why Can't We Be Friends probably had a little bit more spark than Pacific Coast Party, but I do like Pacific Coast Party. So it's just like three good singles, but they're just a lot more kind of subdued and just more refined and lambent compared to what they were doing in the 90s. So there's 13 songs on this album. I'm going to go ahead and recommend the 6 songs out of 13 I recommend. That's decent. So the 6 songs I recommend are I'm a Believer, Pacific Coast Party, Holiday in My Head, She Turns Me On, The Inset, and Hold You High. So talk about the 3 songs I recommend apart from the singles. She Turns Me On is like a real kind of sleek kind of groove for the evening, definitely for evening shindigs. It's especially good around women and hanging out with women in the evening times. It's probably like the younger sister of like Then the Morning Comes, which is really like a night venue and just kind of stepping out kind of tune. It doesn't have the energy of that, but it's just kind of like a sleek. I don't want to say sleazy, but it's within the range of sleazy. Just kind of like a sly kind of song. This has a nice beat, and it's probably one of the more energized tunes, but it's still kind of relatively calm compared to the stuff that they were doing before. But it is good. It's definitely one of the more charming songs on here. Has pretty nice hook. The inset kind of takes it back to the songs that Smash Mouth were doing in 97, the more restaurant kind of music and shopping music. I feel like it's very bouncy, probably one of the most energized songs on here. Definitely meant for busy commute. Inset definitely had more bouncy pep that was like back in Smash Mouth's old days. Definitely something that just kind of reminds me. I mean, it can be restaurant music, but I see this one, the Inset, is more of like shopping music, just kind of being at a shopping mall, going by some of those stores, buying like shirts and shoes and just stuff like that. Just kind of regular busy day commute, just with a little bit more festivities towards it. And then Hold You High is kind of another one similar to that. This one, this is kind of more in like, and then I feel like Hold You High is a really jivey shopping kind of tune, definitely in a romantic sense, just kind of being out and about, just kind of in places. Doesn't just have to be a shopping mall, but just places where you'd be with a little bit more bustle, some places just where you're buying stuff and kind of just kind of in the more consumer kind of aspect of things. Maybe not so much restaurant music, but just kind of in a more romantic stepping out kind of tune in terms of shopping. Just kind of look at it in that sort of context. It's very kind of, I did like the fact that Smash Mouth at least tried to have a couple of these songs that kind of have some of the bustle on here, because I feel like that's something like Smash Mouth on this album tries a little bit of like typical rock type songs where they're not pop rock, but like songs like Your Man, and there might be one other one on here, but there's just like at least a song like Your Man tries to do like alternative rock, like the sort of stuff that Papa Roach and just something that like Papa Roach would do, something in that context. And it just doesn't suit them as well. They kind of, I mean, because when you look after it for 2 albums, Smash Mouth was always trying to be kind of on like the pop rock radio and pop charts, and for them to kind of switch gears, which they didn't do in the singles, but just kind of, you can tell by the second 2 singles that they kind of narrowed it down, where I'm a Believer was like the bank shot one, but then the other singles kind of were just kind of more content with just kind of being on the rock charts and just kind of narrowing it down a bit. But they do have some songs to kind of talk about some of these. Talk about some of the songs I don't like. There's just a lot to list. Basically, all 7 of the songs. There's no almost songs on here, so it's pretty much cut and paste as far as saying the songs I preferred to the songs I didn't. There's just some awkward ones, like Out of Sight was kind of a down tempo song that just didn't hit. I feel like there's some awkward topics on here like Sister Psychic and Shoes and Hats, and like Disenchanted and Keep It Down are kind of awkward ones too. So just kind of, it didn't really have like the connection. I kind of feel like Astro Lounge was just a better concocted album, and it definitely had a lot more energy that played to their high points and was just able to distinguish like the concept. It was just kind of able to distinguish the concept as far as saying that Smash Mouth had their strengths and was able to do it. And I feel like Smash Mouth's strengths on this album are definitely doing pop rock gems like I'm a Believer, but Pacific Coast Party was kind of a new valve that was kind of interesting to kind of see them do. But the alternative rock was just kind of sketchy just because it didn't really work that well for them on Fushu Mang, and it didn't really crest that high in terms of popularity. But I just feel like it was just kind of a step down from where it was just kind of a step down for them in terms of popularity, but they just didn't have enough strong points to really anchor this album. I feel like they kind of, I don't know if they so much avoided it on purpose, but it just didn't really crank out the tunes. Like I really feel like in terms of the highlights that they needed, they definitely needed more songs like The Inset and Hold You High and She Turns Me On, but you just didn't get enough of these. I kind of feel like these kind of more jivey and kind of bouncy shopping and kind of date commute and day commute kind of moments just were very short lived and just not quite as enchanting this time around. It's not to say that they were bad. I mean, I feel like they kind of their melodies and just the production value in terms of the instrumentation was good. I mean, they had some ones on here that showcased that they did have the spark in them, but it just was a very kind of like I want to say disenchanted and just kind of uninspired attempt at doing it. I mean, they at least when they did have the hits they hit and they kept up with like Astro Lounge in terms of that quality, but they just weren't enough, and it was just a very scattershot and mismanaged album in terms of the rest of the album. So that's just kind of the thing. So I'm gonna give this album basically out of 13 songs, me liking 6 out of 13. I'm gonna give this album like a 5 out of 10. I feel like that's about as much as I can do with it. It's just about average. It has some hits on here. It's basically decent, and the quality of the good songs do give it some management to kind of warrant a purchase, but it just doesn't have the sheer crestability that they did before, and it kind of put them back where they were back in 1997, just with a little bit more pop edge, but just not quite as many like album cuts. And this is kind of thing. It's enough that they got to the third single and were able to do things, but it just didn't really. It's kind of like Astro Lounge is the top, but it's kind of like a contest between which album is better, Fushu Mang or Smash Mouth self-titled. So it's just kind of it's in that valve. But I'm a Believer is at least a hit that could somewhat qualify that argument. But the social score, I'm going to give the social score a 6 out of 10 because it does have some gems on here. The singles do hit and they all are good. And I feel like that's a good concept. It's just kind of the concept of whether or not which people are going to fuck with these songs and admit to saying that some of these are good just because you haven't heard them on the radio. So it's just kind of scattershot because some of these songs do kind of hit pretty hard, but they just are not, they're more underground and alternative in a lot of ways. So it just depends upon how big of fans of Smash Mouth you're hanging out with and that type of stuff. So that's just kind of the thing. But in terms of the future, like Smash Mouth has not dropped an album since 2001, and Steve Harwell is not with the group anymore. So we'll have to see what happens with them. But this is pretty much like they're in the top 3 of their best albums, but the rest of their albums from here on out just don't have the chartability of these 3. But this is still pretty solid and decent.